Okay, so as Joe said, next week, as I'm sure many of you know, is another level 4 synoptic window. So the point of this session really is to bit of a pep talk, I guess, ahead of that session, reminding you what this exam is about, and hopefully through an example, giving you an idea of maybe the depth of explanation that you should be trying to aim for next week. Now, all level 4 exams, as I'm sure you know, test your knowledge to an extra depth. The introduction of those written tasks, basically, really challenging your ability to be able to explain what's going on, to show that you really understand this stuff, and being able to analyze and to recommend. The thing about the synoptic, and the second bullet there is a quote from AAT. It is supposed to simulate real work problems. Yeah, this is real life stuff, and you shouldn't forget that when you're attempting the exam. Our recommended approach at the bottom there is to think like a manager. Give your opinion. You've done all this study across level 2, level 3, and level 4. You've learned the calculations. You've learned the theory. It's time to really apply that to a real work scenario. You've got to show the examiner next week that you know your stuff, basically. Don't forget, for a lot of you, maybe options aside, this is your final exam. This is you being turned out into the world as a qualified AAT technician. So why do students do poorly at written questions? Is there general themes in here? Having marked many sort of mock exams in my time, pick out a few things here. Being too brief, not doing yourself justice by showing what you know. Yeah. So you need to study the theory. You need to study the approaches. You need to learn those lists of advantages and disadvantages. I hear a lot of sort of tips and techniques to get through exams, and they are useful. But at the end of the day, they're not going to help you if you don't understand the core knowledge. Yeah. What you need to remember to do next week as well is not just regurgitate theory that you've seen, calculations that you've learned. You have got to apply what you know to the scenario that is in front of you. It has got to be relevant, basically. Students generally don't like written questions. They think accountancy particularly is all about numbers and maths, and it's not, basically. Again, real life. Let's face it, the software deals with most of the number crunching for us these days. And therefore, our job, particularly as management accountants, which I always think is the slam of the level 4 synoptic, we are responsible for interpretation and analysis. It is our job to do the calculations, to produce the reports, and to explain what is going on to management so that they can make a decision. Remember, all through your training, you've been training to become an accountant. The other people in your organization are not accountants. They are employing you to do that job, basically. Now, the third bullet, the point there, the rambling student answer, that's down to a lack of planning. Yeah, so this is where technique does come into play. And remember next week, think about this. Can you use a third of the time that you've given yourself to answer the question to think? That is the important thing. Give yourself time to think. Give yourself the time to make notes, jot down ideas, and basically give yourself some structure before you start typing out your answer. At the end, I'm sure you've done the sample assessments on AAT's website. You're looking at questions that are either 15 or 20 marks generally. So the basic technique is 1.8 minutes a mark. On that basis, a 15-mark question gives you 27 minutes of time, and a 20-mark question gives you 36 minutes of time. But task 1, as you all know from your practice, I'm sure, is a whole load of very short, multi-choice, tick box type questions. And task 5, let's face it, by this stage, you really should be all over financial ratio type questions. So you're not going to take the allotted time on those questions. So there's even more time to devote to those, extended response questions, which are task 2, 3, 4, and 6. So think you can spend a third of your time gathering your thoughts. That will help you to spot any links between the ideas, between the different parts of the question, and will give you a far better structured approach. So the last point, I ran out of time. Keep an eye on the clock. Overall, you got 3 hours. So just make sure you devote enough time to the different questions. So going back to that scenario for GKH, okay, it was maybe a little bit lengthy, but not untypical, perhaps, if you look at the questions that you've been practicing with, for example. What is wrong with that process? And I'm just going to pick out one particular point here. And here's a suggested answer from a student who maybe is not as prepared as they should be for this exam. Carrie, in that scenario, seemed to be doing just about everything. So here's an answer. There's a lack of segregation of duties and it will give rise to fraud. Give me marks, Mr. or Mrs. Examiner. Why would I give many marks for that? There's a lack of effort gone into that answer. Things haven't been explained. So what should we be considering to expand on that answer? How will a lack of segregation of duties give rise to fraud? Tell me that. If fraud happened, what are the consequences for the business? Tell me that. And is fraud the only answer here? Is fraud that common? There's a question. Sure, fraud is possible. If you have staff who are, let's say, lacking in integrity. There you see, I've brought some of our professional ethical principles into my answer already, drawing on the different knowledge that I've learned through my AAT journey. So yes, fraud is possible, and as far as possible, a business needs to reduce the risk that it will happen, and it can do that through improving its controls. So yes, fraud is going to be worthy of comment in your answers somewhere in your exam, but it's not the only thing. I put there, don't forget errors. Yeah, simple errors that can be made because nobody is checking Carrie's work, basically. So the answer that I suggested, lack of segregation of duties, this will give rise to fraud. That doesn't tell me that I've properly thought about this and I've properly analysed it. You should be answering questions from examiners at level 4 generally by making sure that you preempt that red pen. Imagine that marker with a red pen and they're putting question marks after sentences that you've put. They're writing how, they're writing why. If they have the chance to do that, you haven't done your job. Because real life, let's get back to real life again. As a management accountant working for a real company, you've got to put the reports in front of management, explaining to them what those reports are saying. And you've got to try and preempt their questions because they need to make timely decisions. Yeah. And if they have to come back to you with questions, you have not done your job. Yeah. Real life and the level 4 synoptic exam running there in tandem. So let's consider then if we decided to give a range of different responses on the consequences of that lack of segregation of duties. So simple errors could be made by Carrie. Bookings are therefore wrong. Well, what happens if bookings are wrong? Well, customers aren't happy. Well, tell me about that. Yeah. What would happen if customers aren't happy? Well, the business might have to make refunds to those customers. That's a loss of revenue at the end of the day. But of course, also, won't there be additional work involved there for the staff? So there's additional costs involved in admin. All of this is reducing the profit of our business, yet alone the loss of reputation as a result of people turning up, it said in the scenario, assuming they were booked on courses, only to find that the course was already full and they had to go away. So they're not going to come back, are they? But more than that, they're not going to tell their friends that our business is any good. And even more than that, they're probably going to warn their friends to steer well clear. So not only have we lost the customer, but we've lost other customers as well. Errors causing customer dissatisfaction. Errors leading to a lack of compliance. Okay, well, Carrie is doing all the work. She's producing invoices. Well, what if those invoices are wrong? What if she is incorrectly calculating the VAT? Well, then the VAT return is wrong. And effectively, if they were sprung an inspection by HMRC, there would be repercussions for the business. There would be penalties, basically. Costs again. Other errors that could cause incorrect invoices to go out to customers, VAT aside, or even invoices not being sent. So customers are being charged incorrectly, so we're not collecting as much money as we should maybe. We're overcharging other customers who then complain, and then the work has to be done to resolve it all of which ends up in additional costs, and clearly it's all affecting the bottom line. But as well, if invoices are missing and they're not raised at all, what are the cash flow implications for the business? We need to be invoicing promptly, correctly, chasing those invoices up, making sure they're paid within the terms that we offer, to make sure that the business is solvent, to make sure that it's got the cash to pay for its liabilities. You're thinking, blimey, if I had to write all this in an answer, my 27 minutes or whatever is going to flash by. Make the connections. Say enough. Okay, and then I've got the risk of fraud. Whoops, I've just gone too far. I've got the risk of fraud at the bottom. How? Well, Carrie could give family and friends discounts. She could, buck the system, as it were, and not charge at all. Is there a way that she could somehow siphon monies into her own account by putting her own account details on the bottom of the invoice? After all, nobody is checking what she does. And she's in a position where she can hide anything that she's fraudulently doing, because after all, she's putting the basic financial transactions into the accounting systems. I've even got another one. Lack of cover. Who else knows how to do Carrie's job? Presumably, Carrie isn't going to be working every single day of the year. Presumably, she's going to want a holiday at some point. What happens to the business then? Does all her work just stack up and no bookings are dealt with at all? What happens if she's off sick? Having somebody else that knows the job will help. Yeah, it will help with cover, but also it means that somebody else can be involved in that process. So let's consider how segregation of duties helps, apart from the things I've just said. Segregation of duties is just about breaking a process down into smaller tasks, not allowing one person to do the whole thing like Carrie was. Yeah? So, apart from reducing the risk of fraud, because somebody else is involved, somebody else's eyes are looking at what the other person is doing, unless, of course, the pair of them are colluding, in which case then, well, the control isn't working. But someone is always checking the work. Someone is questioning things. Errors will be reduced. And somebody else understands the process to offer that cover when Carrie needs to be off. And you've got a more sustainable business. There's another term dragged into there that you've been learning all about during your level 4 journey. Real life, linking things to real life. The synoptic is about you demonstrating what you've learned across all of the units you've studied, but also drawing on your own experiences. Now, one problem some of you might have drawing on your own experiences is thinking about your own workplace. And some of you, I'm sure, work for small businesses and you work in small offices. You might be the accounts function, and therefore you look at this and think, well, how on earth can I have segregation of duties? My boss isn't just going to go and employ another person just so that I can have segregation of duties. With smaller businesses, it's a question of trust. But the owner, remember, is much closer to the business. They're much closer to the operations. They know everything that is going on. So if errors are being made, if fraud is being committed, if there is inefficiency in the processes which causes delays and unnecessary costs, the owner will know all about it. And therefore, corrections will be made. To work and survive in a small office environment, you have to, as the slide suggests there, take on the commitment and the motivation of the owner. The enthusiasm that the owner shows is, after all, infectious. But the level 4 synoptic scenario, currently Ruby Dale, of course, is not a small business. It is a much larger business. The pre-seen scenarios will be limited companies or PLCs, many more people involved in the day-to-day operation. So in these organizations, the management aren't as close to the day-to-day operations. They aren't as close to the staff. In PLCs, you're talking huge numbers of people. The managers, and this isn't necessarily a good thing, maybe don't even know the names of all of their staff. So staff working for these organizations have different commitments and motivations. So those large organizations somehow have to put rules in place, processes in place, controls in place to try and control the behavior of the staff, to try and make sure that the staff know what they're doing, that the staff are committed, that the staff are motivated, that the staff have that feel for quality, if you like, that the owners at the top of the business still have. So bigger organizations, more rules, more complexity, more compliance as well. How can a large organization trust all of its staff to do what is right and to be committed? That's the problem. So if you have problems relating your real life, because you work for a much smaller business, to the real life scenario in the level 4 synoptic, it's all a question of scale. Some staff working for large organizations just go along to be paid at the end of the day. That's the most important thing to them. And as far as they're concerned, it's 9 to 5. Outside those hours, I just switch off. Yeah, somehow management has to overcome that issue. And I'm not saying they're going to be making staff work beyond 5 o'clock, but during those working hours, they need to make sure that the staff are indeed committed. So all of a sudden, the first answer that I suggested a student might come up with, the weakness is there's a lack of segregation of duties, and this could give rise to fraud. I hope you've got a bit more of an idea now as to why I might be hesitant to award that many marks. That doesn't show me that you've been through levels 2, 3, and 4 of an AAT accountancy qualification. So let me now address the second issue in that scenario. The second issue is about doing some basic costings. It's true that there is a lot more discussion in the level 4 synoptic, but along the way, there will be a requirement to do some calculations to support the arguments, if you like. So here, the requirement is to use relevant costing ideas to show the cost benefit of Nigel's business proposal of installing a new database for the first 2 years of that database. Nigel also wants to know how long he's going to have to wait before he sees a return in his investment. Relevant costs. I'm sure you've come across these in your studies. They were introduced in decision and control, but they heighten in terms of when you come across practice questions in the level 4 synoptic. And what's a relevant cost, though? Relevant to the decision, that's all it means. A relevant cost is a cost that will arise as a result of making the decision. We don't want to get bogged down with historic costs, decisions already made. We want to look at where we are now, and decide, if we make this decision, what costs am I going to incur? What benefits am I actually going to see? So all you need to remember really is a relevant cost is one that is going to be incurred in the future. It is one that is additional to costs you are already incurring. And they're costs that are based on cash transactions. In other words, don't get bogged down with accounting adjustments. So if you came across depreciation costs in a scenario, well, what is a depreciation cost? It's the accountant spreading the initial cost of the asset over its useful life in order to comply with accounting standards. But the asset is already owned. The money has already been spent. So in a relevant costing perspective, depreciation, why would we include it as part of the cost? So looking at the numbers here, and as Joe said at the beginning, Joe and James said at the beginning, the underlying scenario will be available to you after this webinar. So you'll be able to go back and pick up on these numbers. What are the relevant costs within these numbers? So I put them together on this slide. The database itself is a relevant cost. We've got to buy it. But what about Syed? A bit complicated with Syed. He's the IT specialist. He's mainly going to be involved in the work needed. The scenario says that the build and the development will take 35 hours. In addition to those 35 hours, he's going to have to go on a training day, and that's another 7 hours. So we're looking at 42 hours, basically. But importantly, we're currently told that Syed has 23 hours. He's being paid for effectively doing nothing. So it's not going to cost us any more money for Syed to spend those 20 hours working on this database. It's free time for us, effectively. So the cost of those 20 hours is not relevant to our decision. What is relevant are the other hours. And the other hours, we're told, he's going to have to work overtime. Okay, without this database, he wouldn't have to do that overtime. So the overtime cost is relevant, hence the 22 hours at $22.50. Carrie is going to have to do some testing. But to do that, she's going to have to work overtime. So all of those overtime costs are relevant to this decision, so I've included it. The cost of the training course that Syed's going to have to attend, fair enough. That too is a relevant cost. The one I've discounted here is Syed's existing spare time, the 20 hours, because the cost is already incurred by the business. Now, if you do have to do a cost benefit, then effectively make sure that you actually say why you've excluded something. If you don't, it could be that you've just missed it. How do I know? Mark in your exam. So I've got my relevant costs. What are the benefits? Well, evidently, Nigel has worked out we're going to make savings of 400 a month in overtime and other costs. We're doing this cost benefit over 2 years. So there's my calculation, £400 annualized times 2. I've distinctly drawn up a nice little table showing the costs, the benefits, and at the bottom there, I've got a net benefit. So if you're doing this sort of thing at work, what would you do? Real life. You wouldn't hide all of these calculations, all of these numbers in some long-winded, wordy paragraphs. Surely you would produce a nice little clear-to-see table of figures with a little accompanying commentary underneath it or to the side of it. Management need to be able to see things quickly. They're not going to wade through some laborious, meandering commentary to try and pick out the things that they want. They're having to do the interpretation themselves. That's what they pay us for. So there's my cost benefit. And clearly I'm proving that as long as, of course, Nigel's 400 a month is reflective, then this financially anyway has got to be worthwhile. What about that last bit then? How long will Nigel have to wait to see a return on his investment? Do you remember at level 3, you studied costing? You did payback calculations. That's what we're simply doing here, isn't it? It's a simple payback calculation. £2,920 is the cost of the investment. The return on that investment per month is £400. Do the simple calculation and you can see that you will have covered your costs after 7.3 months. Round it up to 8. But we might have to think about other things. I've said there, what about the intangibles? There are potentially some other things that you can't quantify that you might need to take into account. How's the new database going to go down with the staff? Are they IT literate enough to be able to cope with it? Are they going to be nervous about it? Are they going to think it's going to do them out of a job? There's always other things we need to think about, of course. And as I already mentioned, we'll put a question mark as well over Nigel's £400 a month. Where's he got that from? Is it likely to be slightly different to that maybe, which would of course throw our figures. So what I've tried to do is try and make you realise that the level 4 synoptic isn't just a one-off exam. It's not just learn something for those 3 hours, perform well and that's it, forget about it. It is trying to simulate real life. That's why you do get a pre-scene, is to put the questions into some sort of normal, everyday context. You guys are all striving to be qualified accounting technicians. And at work, as you progress through your careers, your job is to help the managers run the business, to help them to make the decisions, to put in front of them the concerns that you might have over how the operation is run. And if you're going to come up with changes that you're going to recommend, what's the first thing a manager is going to turn around and say to you? Well, it's going to cost me money. Why would I spend more money? You've got to prove to them with numbers that this is beneficial to them. Then they'll sit up and then they will take notice. Push yourself next week. Yeah? Go a bit further than lack of segregation of duties. Therefore, there's a risk of fraud. Show the examiner you know your stuff. And the best of luck.